Hi, this is Matt at LSAT Lab. Today's lesson is on weakened questions in the logical reasoning section. So the weakened question type sits within the assumption family in the logical reasoning section. The assumption family is the largest category of logical reasoning questions. 57% of all logical reasoning questions are within the assumption family. 9% of all logical reasoning questions are in the weakened question type. So it's a major question type. It's one that's going to have a big impact on your score. And it can be challenging for a lot of folks. So how do you spot a weakened question? Well, you're looking for language within the question stem that tells you that you're looking at a weakened question. That's the task that's set out for you. So language like most weakens would be a big clue that you're on a weakened question. Or would cast the most doubt. That also tells you that you're looking to undermine the argument. Or the word undermine by itself. Most undermines the argument above. So you kind of get in the sense, we're looking for an answer choice that's going to make the conclusion a little less likely to be true. And a common twist would be one where they ask you to find each of the following weakens except. So the pattern or the process that you want to use for weakened questions is the same that you want to use whenever you're on the assumption family question types, which is first you need to find the conclusion of the argument, then find the evidence that supports that conclusion. And here comes the hard part. You have to evaluate the reasoning, meaning you have to judge the argument and say good or bad and why. And the key here is that every question within the assumption family is a bad argument. So you should always be saying something like, yeah, no, this is not quite right. And then being able to say why. That's going to be the trick. Reasoning structures play a major role in your ability to evaluate an argument. Sometimes your instincts can carry the day. But when intuition isn't enough, you're going to need reasoning structures to be able to break down that argument and figure out exactly where the gap in the reasoning is. And then you want to use that understanding of the gap in the argument to anticipate what an answer might sound like, and then use that to review through the answer choices. So the reasoning structures that are really common within weakened questions, 78% of all weakened questions rely on a comparative reasoning structure in some way or another within the argument itself. So you want to be looking out for arguments that involve a comparison between, let's say, two different things at a point in time, maybe the effectiveness of medication X and the effectiveness of medication Y, which one's more effective? Or one thing at two different time periods. Maybe it's the population of city X today versus the population of city X 10 years ago. So if you kind of look out for those two forms of comparison, it should help you find the ideas that are creating that relative comparison within the argument. Here's an example question that involves a comparative structure. Go ahead and pause the lesson here and try this question on your own. See if you can find an answer that you like. And when you think you have one, hit play and we'll discuss it together. Great, welcome back. So first things first, we need to find the conclusion of the argument. We see it kind of tucked into the middle of the argument here. It says, any such increase would greatly decrease highway safety, however. There's two things pointing at this being the conclusion of the argument. First, the word however is a pivot, and it's an indication that you're moving back toward the author's position and away from some other position. It doesn't necessarily make it the conclusion, but you know this view belongs to the author. Second, and more importantly, it's a prediction. And predictions have a tendency on the LSAT to be conclusions. So do decisions, so do recommendations, so do explanations. When you see those kinds of ideas, you want to be thinking about them as potentially being the conclusion of the argument. Now, we're looking for the evidence. So we see this word since later on in the argument. What comes after the word since is evidence. What comes before it, because it's not the main conclusion, but it is a conclusion, is what we call an intermediate conclusion. So there's an intermediate conclusion here that says that as past experience teaches how higher average highway speeds would result. And why is that? Well, even though most drivers who currently violate posted speed limits would obey higher ones, almost all drivers who obey current speed limits would likely increase their speed. So because of the premise, that's how we know that the intermediate conclusion is true. And this author is suggesting that in conjunction with the claim before the conclusion, that the actual average speeds of highway drivers, which are currently 10 to 20% higher than posted speed limits, proves the conclusion that it would increase, any increase would greatly decrease, any speed increase would decrease highway safety. Right? Now, there is that other first sentence in the beginning of the argument. Now, some people argue that. This isn't a point that the author is suggesting helps support his or her argument. This is a point that the author is arguing against. This is an opposing point, so it's not part of the core of the argument here. So if we take this understanding of the argument, what we want to do is try to figure out, okay, what's the gap in the reasoning? Now that we understand what's the conclusion, what's the evidence for why it's true, now we need to understand why it doesn't work. Okay, so why isn't it true that an increase in speed would greatly decrease highway safety? So it's helpful to kind of think about what are the two worlds that they're suggesting. There's the current state of affairs, and then there's the recommended state of affairs. In the current state of affairs, we have essentially some people who are driving more quickly and some people who are driving a little less quickly. Right? Let's say they're driving 70 miles an hour in the fast lane and 50 miles an hour in the slow lane. Now, the recommendation is to increase the speed limit so that that the cars are driving essentially equally on both sides. Right? What they're proposing is that maybe we'll raise the speed limit to 70. Okay. Well, okay, in the current situation, average highway speed is about 60 miles an hour, whereas on the proposed route, it'd be about 70 miles an hour. Or this is what some people would propose. This is what the author proposes. So we're going to increase highway average speeds if we increase the speed limit to 70 miles an hour, according to the premises of this argument. And the author is suggesting that if we follow this proposed route, we will decrease highway safety, that the situation on the right is more dangerous than the situation on the left. Why is that? Well, we would have higher average speeds. Does that necessarily mean that the new proposed system would be more dangerous? Well, maybe, but you could think of how maybe it'd be more dangerous to have people driving at different speeds on the freeway than it is to have people just driving at a uniform speed on both sides or in both lanes. Right? So potentially, there's these two differences. One is that we're driving at faster rates, but the other difference is that on the new situation, everybody be driving at the same speed, whereas on the old situation, we'd have different speeds out there. Right? So of the two changes, just because we're driving faster, does that necessarily mean that we're going to have a decrease in highway safety? Depends. There's this other factor that may play a role in determining highway safety, and if it turns out that other factor is more important, that would undermine the argument. Okay, so now that we understand that there's two factors kind of changing here, and they're suggesting that a raise in the speed limit is going to decrease highway safety, but there's this other factor that may discount that conclusion, we at least have a sense of the gap, and we can go into the answer choices with an idea of what we're looking for. So if we look at answer choice A, some drivers who obey current speed limits would not change their speed after the introduction of the new speed limits. Well, one thing to notice is that the word some is at the very beginning there. Some drivers who obey current speed limits. One thing to pay attention to is at the very end of this argument, the very last, they say almost all drivers who obey current speed limits would likely increase their speed. Some drivers who obey current speed limits would not change their speed. Answer choice A is consistent with that last statement. It says almost all drivers who obey current speed limits would likely increase their speed. That doesn't mean that everybody would. That leaves room for answer choice A to be true without undermining the argument. So answer choice A is simply too weak to impact the argument since it fits within the original evidence. If we look at answer choice B, uniformity of speeds among vehicles is more important for highway safety than is low average highway speed. Well, this is kind of what we were predicting, that the other factor may be more important than the one that the argument is suggesting would reduce highway safety. Let's hold on to answer choice B and take a look at the rest. Answer choice C says, most drivers who drive 10 to 20% faster than current speed limits have never been involved in a highway accident. I mean, we don't really, just because it would be more dangerous doesn't necessarily mean that we need to have like most drivers who are speeding to be involved in accidents. It could be the case that most drivers who drive 10 to 20% faster have never been involved in an accident, and that's perfectly fine. We're just talking about an increase in or a decrease in safety, and a decrease in safety doesn't require most drivers to have been involved in accidents or most drivers to have not been involved in accidents. Right? We could have just a few people involved in accidents and then maybe a few more, and that would increase or decrease highway safety. But it doesn't necessarily require crossing that threshold of most drivers. So C is, again, it's too weak to actually impact the argument, right? Because it's consistent with the original argument. If you're looking at choice D, some drivers who violate current speed limits would also violate higher speed limits. Fine. What are they telling us here? In the evidence, even though most drivers who currently violate posted speed limits would obey higher ones, that never assumes that all of them would obey higher ones. So answer choice D also fits within the argument and is too weak to impact it. Let's take a look at answer choice D. Some drivers who violate current speed limits would also violate higher speed limits. This is very similar to answer choice A. It's just, it feels like it's contradicting a different part of the argument, even though it's not. Right after the word since, even though most drivers who currently violate posted speed limits would obey higher ones. That doesn't say that they would, all of them would obey higher ones. It says most of them would obey higher ones. So the fact that some would not, according to answer choice D, doesn't really hurt the argument. It's consistent with the original argument. So let's look at answer choice E. Most drivers who violate current speed limits determine their speeds by what they believe to be safe in the situation. What these people believe to be safe in the situation simply isn't relevant to the argument. So this one's out of scope. And that lets us choose answer choice B with confidence. So let's look at another reasoning structure. Let's look at the reasoning structure of causation, which is also a major player on weakened questions. 52% of all weakened questions involve some element of causation. So you want to be on the lookout for causal reasoning structures within the argument to help you get a better idea of what's wrong with the argument, what's the gap in its reasoning, so that you can point it out with the right answer. So here's an example question. Go ahead and try this question on your own. See if you can find an answer that you like, and when you're ready to discuss, hit play again, and we'll come back and do it together. All right. So remember, the first thing we want to do is find the conclusion of the argument. And in this case, it's the first sentence. One theory to explain the sudden extinction of all dinosaurs points to drug overdoses as the cause. So we see the word cause in there. We also see the word explain, helping us identify that idea as a conclusion. And then what's the evidence for why it's true? They give us a lot of information in the middle there, but really it's at the end of the argument where we finally get the evidence for why that first point was true. So they're basically trying to distract us with a bunch of information in the middle there. But the evidence is essentially that this theory receives its strongest support from the fact that it helps explain why so many dinosaur fossils are found in unusual and contorted positions. Okay, so this is actually a pretty common structure that you want to be on the lookout for in the logical reasoning section, but it's the idea of a phenomenon and an explanation of it. And the phenomenon typically is the evidence, and then the conclusion offers an explanation for how or why it happened, and that explanation generally serves as a causal relationship. There's a causal mechanism. They're saying that the explanation is what caused the phenomenon to occur. So in this case, they're saying that the explanation for why the dinosaurs are found in contorted positions is essentially drug overdoses. Well, I mean, when you're trying to weaken a phenomenon explanation structure, you really want to be keeping a few things in mind. So there's pretty common ways in which you want to do so. You want to either provide an alternative explanation, provide an example of the presumed cause occurring without the presumed effect occurring, or provide an example of the presumed effect occurring somewhere without the presumed cause occurring. None of these absolutely destroys the causal explanation. But what they do is they make it a little less likely for their explanation to be the right explanation, which is all you really need to accomplish on a weakened question. You don't need to destroy the conclusion. You simply need to make it a little less likely to be true. So we want to be looking out for one of those three things as we're going through the answer choices. What could be an alternative explanation for why the dinosaurs are found in contorted positions? Or maybe if we could find dinosaurs found in contorted positions or animals found in contorted positions that weren't poisoned through these drug overdoses. Or if we could find animals that were poisoned through these drug overdoses but weren't found in contorted positions. The latter two essentially undermine the correlation between the two events, which makes the explanation a little less likely. And this first one simply provides an alternative explanation that could show how something else could have made that happen. So keep those in mind as we go through the choices. Answer choice A says that most fossils of large mammals are found in contorted positions. Well, geez, remember, they tell us throughout the middle of that information that mammals essentially aren't susceptible to the same kind of poisoning because they can taste the bitterness and they have livers, right? So they're not going to be poisoned by these angiosperms. And so if we have mammals that are found in contorted positions, but weren't poisoned, right? That would essentially give us the effect without the cause. Answer choice A looks like an answer choice we should hold on to and see what else they give us. Answer choice B says that angiosperms provide a great deal of nutrition. What nutrition has to do with this doesn't really make any sense, so this one's simply out of scope. Or answer choice B, angiosperms provide a great deal of nutrition. Well, maybe this would explain why dinosaurs decided to eat the angiosperms. If anything, this might strengthen the argument by helping us understand why dinosaurs would potentially eat the angiosperms. Answer choice C says carnivorous dinosaurs mostly ate other vegetarian dinosaurs that fed on angiosperms. Okay, this also seems to strengthen the argument because it's helping us understand how the carnivorous dinosaurs may have also been found in contorted positions, right? Because they're eating the dinosaurs that were poisoned, so potentially that would be how they were poisoned as well. So this one also strengthens the argument. Answer choice D. Some poisonous plants do not produce amino acid-based alkaloids. What these other poisonous plants are doing, whether they are or they're not producing amino acid-based alkaloids, they're still poisonous, right? And we have no clue whether these are the angiosperms, so they're simply out of scope. E. Mammals sometimes die of drug overdoses from eating angiosperms. Mammals sometimes die of drug overdoses from eating angiosperms. Most plant-eating mammals avoid these potential... notice this. So they're saying most plant-eating mammals avoid these potentially lethal poisons because they can taste bitter. And they have livers to help them. But that word most still leaves room for some to not, which is what answer choice E is saying. Answer choice E is one of those answer choices that seems like it's going against some of the evidence, but it's actually consistent with the evidence. And so it's too weak to actually weaken the argument. That leaves us back with answer choice A. That gives us the effect without the cause, and that's our answer. So let's think about the kinds of wrong answers that are going to come up frequently when you're working on weakened questions. The most common wrong answer type, so 37% of wrong answers, are wrong because they're simply out of scope. And those should be the ones that you get rid of on the first pass. The next biggest category is over in the degree area. So answer choices that are simply too weak to impact the argument. So you're looking for answer choices that are close, but not quite. And if you can find places where an answer choice could be weakened down a little bit, it can help you when you're debating between those last two answer choices. The degree of an answer choice is a great way to finish your work when you're trying to eliminate the wrong answer choices. It's not such a good way to start your work. So on that first pass, it may not be the best idea to try to eliminate all the weak answer choices. But if you're down to two and you see that one of them is weaker than the other, that's maybe a good place to finish. Eliminating that last weak answer choice can help you find the one that weakens the argument the most. The next most likely kind of wrong answer would be an answer choice that moves in the wrong direction. An answer choice that actually strengthens the argument instead of weakening it can be tempting because it's relevant. And when you're getting rid of answer choices that are out of scope, right, an answer choice that is relevant can sometimes be hard to hear that it's moving in the wrong direction. So pay attention to answer choices that are relevant, but just moving in the wrong direction. 24% of all wrong answers on weakened questions are wrong because they're strengthening the argument. And then there's a couple of others like irrelevant relationships or term shifts where it's a couple of percent each. But primarily you want to be thinking about answer choices that are out of scope, answer choices that are doing the opposite of what they're supposed to, and answer choices that are simply too weak to impact the argument. The process in summary, remember, is to find the conclusion, find the evidence that supports that conclusion, evaluate that argument using reasoning structures to help you figure out what the gap in the argument is, use that understanding of the gap to anticipate what an answer might sound like, and then review the answers. You spot a weakened question with language in the question stem like most weakens, most undermines, most calls into question, weakens, except, etc. And the reasoning structures you want to be on the lookout for. Comparison plays a major role at 78% of all weakened questions involve comparison reasoning. 52% of all weakened questions involve causal reasoning. Obviously, there's an overlap and many questions involve both. Conditional logic, however, is not a major player when it comes to weakened questions. Finally, the trap answers you want to be looking out for: out of scope, answer choices that move in the wrong direction, but with strengthening the argument instead of weakening it, answer choices that are simply too weak to have an impact. Those are the main ones that you want to be paying attention to. So that's it for today. I invite you to visit some of these lessons right here, or visit us at lsatlab.com and check out our powerful tools today.